The deafening crack of a sniper rifle echoed through the park, tearing the tranquil afternoon to shreds. She didn't scream. She just threw her body over his children as the concrete exploded red. In that breathless, terrifying second, the city's most ruthless crime boss realized he was holding an angel. Clara Hastings didn't belong in the dark, glittering world of Chicago's elite, and she certainly didn't belong in the heavily guarded Lake Forest estate of Dante Russo. At 26, Clara was drowning in a mountain of medical debt left behind after her mother's passing. She was a preschool teacher with a spotless record, a gentle demeanor, and absolutely no options left. When an exclusive high society staffing agency offered her a contract that would wipe her debts clean in a single year, she signed it without asking too many questions. She should have asked questions. Dante Russo wasn't just a billionaire shipping magnate. He was the head of the Russo Syndicate, the undisputed king of the city's underground logistics and illegal ports. To the public, he was a tragic widower. To the criminal underworld, he was a cold, calculating reaper who had consolidated power through sheer, unapologetic ruthlessness after his wife, Amelia, was killed in a car bombing 14 months ago. But to 6-year-old twins, Chloe and Oliver, he was just a ghost. On Clara's first day, she stood in the grand, marble-floored foyer of the Russo mansion, her cheap loafers sinking into a hand-woven Persian rug. The house felt less like a home and more like a fortress. Men in tailored Italian suits with obvious bulges beneath their jackets stood at the perimeter. Then Dante descended the sweeping staircase. He was imposing, exuding a quiet, lethal authority. His dark eyes locked onto Clara, scanning her with the precision of a predator categorizing a threat. "You're the new nanny," Dante stated, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't a question. "Clara Hastings, Mr. Russo, it's a pleasure to—" "I don't care about pleasantries, Miss Hastings," he interrupted, stepping closer. The scent of bergamot and expensive cigar smoke washed over her. "My children have gone through 4 nannies in 6 months. They don't speak, not since the incident. I don't need you to be their mother. I need you to keep them safe, keep them quiet, and keep out of my way. Do you understand?" Clara lifted her chin, refusing to break eye contact despite the primal instinct screaming at her to look away. "I understand, Mr. Russo, but I'm here to care for them, not just guard them. If you wanted a warden, you should have hired another man in a suit." For a fraction of a second, surprise flickered in Dante's eyes. Nobody spoke to him like that. Nobody. But instead of throwing her out, he simply gave a curt nod and walked past her, surrounded by his security detail. Clara soon met the twins in the sprawling, sunlit playroom. Chloe and Oliver were beautiful children, with their father's dark hair and pale, haunted eyes. They sat on the floor, surrounded by thousands of dollars worth of untouched toys, staring blankly at a television screen. Clara didn't force them to talk. She didn't offer false, overwhelming cheerfulness. Instead, she sat on the floor opposite them, pulled out a large sketch pad, and simply began to draw. She drew dragons, castles, and intricate forests. For 3 days she did this, speaking in a soft, calm voice about the stories in her pictures. On the 4th day, Oliver slid an inch toward her. On the 5th day, Chloe picked up a blue crayon and silently handed it to Clara. It was a breakthrough that brought tears to Clara's eyes. Over the next 4 months, the mansion began to change. Clara was the sunlight breaking through the cold marble walls. She baked cookies with the twins, their laughter a sound that hadn't been heard in the house for over a year, echoing down the long, sterile hallways. She got them painting, playing in the gardens, and slowly, gently, coaxing them to speak again. Dante watched from the shadows. He was a man consumed by his empire and his enemies, particularly a rival faction led by the vicious Romano family. Yet, he found himself lingering by his study door just to hear Clara's bright, melodic laugh. He watched how she treated his children not as broken things, but as precious, brilliant kids who just needed a safe place to land. He also noticed how she treated him not with the fawning terror his men showed, but with a quiet, respectful defiance. One rainy evening, Dante found Clara asleep on the sofa in the library, a children's book resting on her chest, with Chloe and Oliver curled up on either side of her. Dante stood in the doorway, a sudden, unfamiliar tightness gripping his chest. For the first time since Amelia died, the house didn't feel like a tomb. It felt alive. He reached out and draped a heavy cashmere blanket over the three of them. Clara stirred, opening her eyes to see the feared Mafia boss looking at her with a vulnerability he hid from the rest of the world. "Thank you," she whispered sleepily. Dante didn't say a word. He just nodded and retreated into the darkness, terrified of the light she was bringing into his blood-soaked world. 6 months into her contract, Clara had become the center of gravity for the twins. Dante had even begun to join them for occasional dinners, the icy walls around his heart thawing fractionally with every smile Clara aimed in his direction. But peace is a fragile illusion in the world of the Cosa Nostra. It was a crisp, brilliant Tuesday afternoon. Clara had convinced Dante to allow the twins a rare excursion to the city's grand botanical glasshouse, a sprawling indoor garden in the heart of the park. Dante was supposed to accompany them, but a sudden, catastrophic disruption at the southern shipping docks, a deliberate sabotage by the Romano syndicate, forced him into an emergency sit-down. Instead, Clara and the twins were flanked by 4 of Dante's elite guards, led by a seasoned enforcer named Bennett. The glass house was a humid, lush paradise, bursting with the colors of exotic orchids and towering ferns. Chloe was holding tightly to Clara's left hand, while Oliver excitedly pointed out a massive koi pond. Clara should have been relaxed, but a knot of anxiety twisted in her stomach. She noticed it subtly at first. Bennett, usually hypervigilant, kept checking his encrypted phone, his brow furrowed in sweat. The other 3 guards were spaced too far apart. The civilian crowd in the botanical garden was unusually sparse for a beautiful afternoon. "Bennett!" Clara called out softly, keeping her smile fixed for the children. "Is everything all right? The perimeter feels a little loose." Bennett snapped his head toward her, his eyes darting to the exits. "Everything is fine, Miss Hastings. Just keep the kids moving toward the central dome." Clara's instincts screamed at her. She tightened her grip on the twins' hands. "Oliver, Chloe, let's play a game. Let's see how fast we can walk to the car." "But the fish, Clara," Oliver protested. "Next time, sweetie. Come on." They had just reached the threshold of the massive, domed atrium when the glass ceiling shattered. It wasn't an accident. It was a coordinated, military-style breach. Grappling lines dropped through the shattered glass, and 4 heavily armed men in tactical gear and black ski masks descended into the foliage. Simultaneously, the heavy wooden doors of the entrance kicked open, revealing 3 more armed men. The botanical garden erupted into sheer chaos. Gunfire tore through the humid air, shredding the leaves of ancient palms and exploding terracotta pots into deadly shrapnel. "Get down!" Bennett roared, pulling his weapon, but he was immediately cut down by a burst of automatic fire from the balcony. He fell hard, the betrayal of his own distraction costing him his life. Clara didn't freeze. Adrenaline flooded her veins, sharp and cold. "Chloe! Oliver, run!" she screamed, shoving the children behind a massive, solid stone planter housing a weeping fig tree. She crouched over them, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The remaining Russo guards were returning fire, the deafening noise echoing off the glass walls. But the attackers weren't aiming for the guards. They were advancing systematically, their eyes scanning the underbrush. They were looking for the children. It was a kidnapping operation. "Clara, I'm scared," Chloe sobbed, burying her face into Clara's chest. "I know, baby. I know. Shh. Keep your head down," Clara whispered fiercely, pressing both children flat against the cool dirt. Through the gaps in the leaves, Clara saw a masked man step over the body of a fallen guard. He was 50 feet away, walking with terrifying calm, his head turned, and through the foliage, his eyes locked dead onto Clara. He raised an assault rifle, the dark muzzle pointing directly at the stone planter. He had a clear angle on Oliver. Time seemed to slow to an excruciating crawl. Clara didn't think. She didn't weigh the value of her life against the mob boss's son. She acted on the pure, unfiltered love she had developed for the boy, whose first words in a year were spoken to her. As the gunman's finger squeezed the trigger, Clara lunged forward, throwing her entire body over Oliver, effectively shielding both twins with her back. Crack. The impact felt like being struck by a freight train swinging a sledgehammer. A blinding, searing agony erupted in Clara's upper back, right below her shoulder blade. The force threw her forward, driving the breath from her lungs in a sickening gasp. She collapsed over the children, her vision instantly swimming with black spots. "Clara!" Oliver screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. Blood, hot and terrifyingly fast, soaked through her light summer dress, dripping onto the white marble floor. Clara tried to speak, to tell them to stay down, but she could only taste copper. Before the gunman could take a second shot, the glass house doors were blown entirely off their hinges. Dante Russo had arrived. He was a vision of absolute nightmare, his tailored suit jacket gone, an automatic weapon in his hands. He hadn't waited for backup. He had driven his own armored SUV straight through the park gates the moment his security feed went dark. The wrath of the grieving widower was unleashed. Dante moved with terrifying, lethal precision, dropping the gunman who had shot Clara with 2 rounds to the chest before the man could even pivot. His remaining men flooded the building, overpowering the Romano hit squad in a matter of seconds. But Dante didn't care about the enemies bleeding out on the floor. He dropped his weapon, his eyes finding the small, huddled mass of his children behind the stone planter. "Chloe! Oliver!" he roared, sprinting across the shattered glass. He fell to his knees, pulling his crying, terrified children into his arms. They were perfectly safe, not a scratch on them. Then he looked down. Clara was lying on her side, her face chalk white, her breath coming in shallow, wet rasps. A dark, expanding pool of crimson was staining the soil around her. Dante's heart simply stopped. The man who ordered executions without blinking felt a raw, tearing panic rip through his soul. He scooped Clara up, pressing his large, shaking hands against the bullet wound on her back to stem the bleeding. "Clara! Clara, look at me!" Dante ordered, his voice cracking, shedding the armor of the Mafia boss entirely. "Stay with me." Clara's eyelids fluttered. She forced them open, her glassy eyes finding Dante's terrified face. She didn't ask for a doctor. She didn't cry for herself. The twins," she choked out, a thin line of blood trickling from the corner of her mouth. "Are they okay?" "They're fine. Because of you, they're fine," Dante choked back, lifting her into his arms as he stood up, screaming for his men to get the car. "You took a bullet for them. Why did you do that?" Clara offered a weak, ghostly smile, her hand limply grabbing his blood-soaked shirt. "Because they're my babies, too." Her eyes rolled back, her hand falling limp, and Clara Hastings slipped into the dark. The sterile, blinding white lights of the private surgical wing at St. Jude's Medical Center felt like a mocking contrast to the violence staining Dante Russo's clothes. He paced the length of the secluded corridor like a caged panther, his expensive Italian leather shoes leaving faint, rust-colored footprints on the polished linoleum. His hands, usually so steady when holding a weapon or signing away a rival's life, were trembling violently. They were covered in Clara's blood. He couldn't wash it off. Every time he looked at his palms, he saw her pale face, heard the sickening, wet gasp of her breath failing, and felt the terrifying stillness of her body in his arms. 14 months ago, Dante had sat in a very similar waiting room while surgeons tried to piece his wife Amelia back together after the car bombing. They had failed. The memory was a suffocating weight pressing down on his chest, threatening to crack his ribs. But this was a different kind of agony. Amelia had been an innocent casualty of his war. Clara had actively chosen to step into the crossfire. She had looked death in the eye and traded her life for his son's. The heavy double doors of Operating Room 4 pushed open. Dr. Harrison, a brilliant trauma surgeon on the Russo Syndicate's private payroll, stepped out. His green scrubs were dark with sweat, and his surgical mask hung loosely around his neck. Dante crossed the distance in 2 massive strides, grabbing the doctor by the shoulders. "Is she alive?" he demanded, his voice a lethal, vibrating growl. "Tell me she is breathing, Harrison." "She's alive, Mr. Russo," Dr. Harrison said quickly, putting his hands up in a placating gesture. But it was a catastrophic injury. The bullet entered just below her right shoulder blade. It shattered the scapula, completely collapsed her right lung, and missed her ascending aorta by less than a millimeter. She lost a massive amount of blood before you got her here. Dante released the doctor, taking a ragged step back. He dragged a blood-stained hand down his face. "But she will live." "We've stabilized her," Harrison replied cautiously. "We removed the bullet fragments and repaired the lung tissue. However, her body endured severe trauma, and she is in a medically induced coma to manage the swelling and pain. The next 48 hours are critical. If she doesn't develop an infection, she has a fighting chance." "Give her the best," Dante ordered, his voice cracking with an emotion he hadn't let himself feel in a year. "The best nurses, the best medication, the best room. If she needs a lung, buy one. If she needs blood, take mine. Do you understand me?" "Perfectly, sir." Dante turned away, staring blindly out the hospital window into the sprawling neon-lit grid of Chicago. The city was his domain, yet he felt entirely powerless. A soft tug on his ruined suit jacket pulled him from his dark thoughts. He looked down. Chloe and Oliver stood there, flanked by his most heavily armed men. The twins looked so small, their eyes red and swollen from crying. Oliver was clutching Clara's worn, leather-bound sketch pad to his chest like a shield. Dante dropped to his knees, heedless of the blood still on his clothes, and pulled his children into a desperate embrace. They clung to him. "Is Clara going to go away like Mommy did?" Oliver whispered, his tiny voice trembling. Dante squeezed his eyes shut, a single hot tear escaping and tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. "No," he vowed fiercely, pressing a kiss to his son's hair. "No, buddy. She is the strongest person I have ever met. She isn't going anywhere." He stayed on his knees for a long time, holding the only 3 things in the world that mattered to him. When the twins finally fell asleep from sheer emotional exhaustion on a hospital sofa, Dante stood up. The vulnerability vanished from his eyes, replaced by an endless, freezing void. The grieving father was gone. The boss of the Russo Syndicate was back, and he was hungry for souls. He walked past his security detail, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly calm. "Keep this floor locked down. Nobody gets in or out without my authorization." He stepped into the elevator, pulling a sleek black phone from his pocket. He dialed a number that only one man answered. "Silas, the Romano hit squad that attacked the glass house. Tell me you left one alive." "We did, boss." Silas's voice crackled through the receiver, devoid of any emotion. "We have him in the meat locker at the Southside warehouse. He's been prepped for your arrival." "Good," Dante said, stepping out into the cold night air. "I'm coming. And Silas? Prepare the acid vats. I want him to know exactly what happens when you touch my family." The interrogation in the freezing, blood-stained basement of the warehouse lasted less than 20 minutes. The surviving Romano hitman, a young, arrogant foot soldier whose confidence evaporated the moment Dante walked through the heavy steel door, sang like a canary. But the song he sang made Dante's blood run entirely cold. "We didn't know," the hitman sobbed, spitting blood onto the concrete floor. "We just followed the tip. We were told the perimeter would be light. We were told the exact gate you would use, the exact time the nanny would take the kids to the center dome. Dante paused, a scalpel dripping in his hand. He tilted his head, his dark eyes narrowing into predatory slits. A tip. From who? "I don't know a name," the man shrieked, straining against the zip ties cutting into his wrists. "I swear to God." It was a burner phone, but my boss said it was a golden ticket. He said it came from inside your own house. Someone who wanted you distracted. Someone who wanted you to declare war on us so they could sweep up the weapons trade while we burned each other down. Dante froze. The glasshouse trip was a spontaneous decision. Only Clara, the twins, and the security detail knew about it. And the head of his personal security detail, the man who arranged the transports and the guards, the man who was supposed to be his right hand, was Gregory. Gregory, who had been pushing Dante for months to wage a full-scale bloody war against the Romanos. Gregory, who believed Dante had gone soft since hiring Clara. Dante didn't say another word. He turned on his heel, dropping the bloody scalpel onto a metal tray. "Finish him," he told Silas coldly. As the muffled screams echoed behind him, Dante stepped back into the Chicago night. The war with the Romanos was secondary now. He had a Judas in his house, and Gregory was about to learn that hell hath no fury like a Mafia king betrayed. For 3 agonizing days, Clara floated in a dark, formless void. Sometimes she heard the rhythmic, incessant beeping of machines. Sometimes she felt the ghost of a child's hand slipping from her grasp, causing her to thrash in a panic against invisible restraints. But mostly, she felt a strong, warm presence beside her, a steady anchor keeping her from drifting away entirely. She kept hearing a low, rough voice reading children's stories, the very stories she had drawn in her sketchpad. When Clara finally forced her heavy eyelids open, the light was blinding. She let out a dry, raspy cough, and instantly, a searing, white-hot pain ripped through her right shoulder and chest. She moaned, squeezing her eyes shut. "Shh. Don't move. You're safe." The voice was rough, exhausted, and incredibly gentle. Clara blinked the blurriness away and turned her head slightly on the crisp white pillow. Dante Russo was sitting in a stiff plastic chair beside her bed. He looked entirely wrecked. His usually immaculate dark hair was unkempt. A dark shadow of stubble covered his jaw, and he was wearing a wrinkled dress shirt without a tie. But his dark eyes, fixed on her face, were burning with an intensity that made Clara's breath catch in her throat. "Dante," she rasped, her throat feeling like sandpaper. It was the first time she had used his first name. He leaned forward, pouring a small cup of water from a plastic pitcher and gently guiding a straw to her dry lips. "Drink slowly." She took a sip, the cool water feeling like a miracle. As she pulled back, her memory returned in a violent, crashing wave. The shattered glass, the gunfire, the masked man aiming at Oliver, the impact. "The twins!" Clara gasped, trying to sit up, only to be forced down by a fresh wave of agony. "Where are they? Are they hurt?" Dante caught her shoulders, his large hands incredibly gentle, pressing her back against the mattress. "They are perfectly safe, Clara. Not a single scratch. They are at the safe house with my most trusted men. They've been asking for you every single hour." Clara let out a long, shuddering sigh of relief, tears pricking the corners of her eyes. Thank God. Dante stared at her, his jaw tightening. He reached out, his fingertips brushing a stray lock of hair away from her pale forehead. "You took a bullet for them," he whispered, his voice vibrating with a mixture of awe and suppressed rage. "You threw yourself in front of an assault rifle. You are a preschool teacher, Clara." "Why?" Clara looked into his dark, storm-filled eyes. She didn't see the ruthless mafia boss the city feared. She saw a terrified father. "I didn't think about it," she admitted softly, her voice weak but steady. "I just saw the gun, and I knew I couldn't let them be hurt. They've already lost so much, Dante. They're my babies, too. I love them." Dante inhaled sharply. The invisible steel walls he had built around his heart since Amelia's death finally, completely shattered. He leaned his forehead against the edge of her mattress, his large hand enveloping hers. "You are an absolute fool," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion, "and you are the bravest person I have ever known. I owe you my life, Clara. I owe you my soul." He lifted his head, and for a long moment, they just looked at each other. The air in the hospital room shifted, heavy with an unspoken realization. Clara realized she hadn't just fallen in love with the children. She had fallen in love with the broken, dangerous man who would do anything to protect them. And Dante realized that the angel bleeding in his hospital bed was the only light left in his dark world. He leaned in, his lips brushing softly against her forehead. "Rest now. Nobody will ever hurt you again. I promise you that." When Dante stepped out of Clara's hospital room an hour later, the tenderness vanished from his face, replaced by a mask of pure, absolute ice. He pulled his phone out and dialed his second-in-command. "Silas. Is it done?" "Yes, boss. We intercepted the wire transfers." Gregory moved $5 million into an offshore account 20 minutes after the Botanical Garden shooting. He also authorized the withdrawal of our heavy artillery from the western docks. He's prepping for a street war. He thinks you're paralyzed by grief. "Where is he?" Dante asked, his voice deadly quiet. "He called a meeting with the capos at the primary shipping warehouse. He's trying to consolidate power while you're at the hospital. He's telling them you're unfit to lead. Keep the capos there. Lock the doors." 30 minutes later, Dante's black SUV pulled into the sprawling, dimly lit shipping warehouse on the edge of Lake Michigan. He walked through the massive loading bay doors alone, his dark trench coat billowing behind him. Inside, 10 of his highest-ranking men sat around a makeshift table of wooden shipping crates. At the head of the table stood Gregory, a sharp-featured man in his late 40s, mid-speech. "Dante is a ghost of a man," Gregory was shouting, slamming his fist on the crate. First his wife, now he's weeping over a glorified babysitter while the Romanos spit on our territory. "We need a leader who isn't blinded by..." "By what, Gregory?" The entire warehouse went deathly silent. 10 hardened criminals froze as Dante stepped into the harsh overhead light. He didn't look like a grieving, broken man. He looked like the Grim Reaper, in a tailored suit, Gregory's face drained of color. "Dante, boss, you should be at the hospital." "I was," Dante said, walking slowly toward the table. His footsteps echoed like gunshots in the cavernous space. Clara woke up. She's going to live. A microsecond of panic flashed in Gregory's eyes, but he quickly masked it with a wide, fake smile. "That's incredible news, boss. We were just discussing how to retaliate against the Romanos for what they did to her and the kids." "Were you?" Dante stopped at the opposite end of the table. He pulled a thick manila folder from his coat and tossed it onto the wood. It slid across the table, stopping right in front of Gregory. "Because it looks like you were busy wiring $5 million to a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands. The exact amount the Romanos demanded to open their southern ports to our smuggling routes." Gregory stared at the folder, sweat beading on his forehead. "Boss, this is a misunderstanding. Silas is framing me. You know I would never." "You gave them the schedule," Dante interrupted, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "You gave the Romanos the exact coordinates of my children to force a war. You used my flesh and blood as bait so you could steal my throne." Gregory swallowed hard, glancing at the capos around the table. None of them moved. They were loyal to the crown, and the crown was Dante. Realizing he was cornered, Gregory dropped the act. His face twisted into an ugly sneer. "You went soft, Dante." Gregory spat, stepping back and reaching for the gun in his shoulder holster. "You used to be a king. Now you're playing house with a broke preschool teacher." Someone had to make a move to protect the business. Gregory never managed to unholster his weapon. Dante's hand moved with blinding speed. The deafening roar of his silver desert eagle echoed through the warehouse. Gregory stumbled backward, a dark red flower blooming on the center of his chest. He looked down at the wound in shock, his knees buckling. He collapsed onto the concrete floor, choking on his own blood. Dante didn't flinch. He holstered his weapon and looked around the table at the pale faces of his capos. "The Romanos die tonight. Every single one of them," Dante ordered, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "Burn their warehouses, sink their shipments, and bring me the head of their boss. And if anyone else in this room thinks I have gone soft," Dante stepped over Gregory's twitching body, "I invite you to make your move right now." Nobody breathed. The king had returned, and his wrath would burn the city to ashes to protect his angel. That night, the criminal underworld of Chicago didn't just shift, it was systematically dismantled. Dante Russo unleashed a tactical masterclass of violence that the city's federal investigators would study for decades to come. By 4:00 a.m., the Romano Syndicate ceased to exist. Their illicit warehouses in the South Loop were reduced to smoldering ash. Their illegal gambling vessels docked at Burnham Harbor were resting at the bottom of Lake Michigan, and Vincent Romano, the architect of the Glass House ambush, was found by local police the next morning, hanging by his wrists from the rafters of his own meatpacking plant in the Fulton Market District. The king had defended his castle, but as the smoke cleared over the city skyline, Dante realized that a throne built on blood would always attract scavengers. 3 weeks later, the sterile walls of St. Jude's Medical Center felt entirely different. Clara was finally out of the ICU, transferred to a private rehabilitation suite. Her recovery was grueling. The gunshot had permanently damaged the nerves in her right shoulder, making even the simple act of lifting a glass of water an excruciating battle. Yet, she never complained. Every afternoon, the heavy oak door of her suite would swing open, and Chloe and Oliver would rush in, their arms full of finger paintings and wild stories, breathing life back into her healing lungs. And every evening, after the twins were escorted back to the safe house, Dante remained. The feared Mafia boss had transformed into a devoted sentinel. He fed her ice chips when her throat was dry, read to her when she was too exhausted to keep her eyes open, and held her uninjured hand through the worst of the night terrors. It was during one of these quiet, moonlit vigils that Silas, Dante's newly appointed right-hand man, entered the hospital room. He carried a decrypted tablet recovered from the late Gregory's private estate. "Boss," Silas whispered, glancing respectfully at Clara, who was sleeping under the heavy influence of painkillers. "You need to see this." "We finished scrubbing Gregory's offshore servers." Dante carefully released Clara's hand and stepped out into the fluorescent-lit hallway. "What is it?" "Gregory didn't just leak your schedule to the Romanos," Silas said, his voice laced with disgust. "He orchestrated this from the very beginning. He handpicked Miss Hastings from the Kensington Elite Staffing Database. He dug into her background and found out about the 6-figure debt her mother left behind at Mercy General Hospital. He knew she was desperate, isolated, and drowning." Dante's jaw clenched, his eyes turning cold. "Go on." "He thought she would be weak," Silas explained. He assumed a desperate, untrained civilian under that much financial and emotional stress would crack. He banked on her being negligent, hoping she would leave the children vulnerable enough for a kidnapping, which would force you to step down in grief. He brought her into the house as a sacrificial lamb. Dante looked through the glass window of the hospital door, watching Clara's chest rise and fall in a slow, steady rhythm. Gregory had brought an angel into the devil's house, expecting her to be a pawn. Instead, she had thrown herself into the line of fire, shattering an empire to protect 2 children she had known for barely 6 months. "He underestimated her," Dante whispered, his voice thick with a profound, earth-shattering realization. "We all did." That night changed the trajectory of the Russo legacy forever. For years, federal investigators from the Chicago field office wondered what triggered the sudden, overnight collapse of the city's most violent crime ring. The truth was never filed in a police report. The truth was that a man looked at the woman he loved, bleeding in a hospital bed, and decided the darkness was no longer worth the cost. Dante called a summit with the remaining faction leaders of the Midwest. In a move that sent shockwaves through the global underworld, he officially ceded all of the Russo syndicate's illegal arms, gambling, and extortion routes to Silas. He kept only the shipping ports, pouring his vast, immense wealth into legitimizing Russo logistics, transforming it into a fully legal, transparent maritime empire. He washed the blood from his hands, all so he could be clean enough to hold hers. 6 months later, spring had finally broken through the bitter Chicago winter. The gardens of the Lake Forest estate were in full bloom, practically glowing under the warm afternoon sun. Clara stood by the edge of the sprawling koi pond, leaning slightly on a custom-carved wooden cane. Her right arm was still weak, but her smile was brighter than it had ever been. A few yards away, Chloe and Oliver were chasing a golden retriever puppy, a welcome home gift that had effectively erased the last remnants of their trauma. She heard the familiar, heavy footsteps on the gravel path before she felt his arms wrap gently around her waist from behind. Dante pressed a soft, lingering kiss to the scarred skin of her shoulder, right where the bullet had entered. It was a gesture he made every single day, a silent vow of his eternal gratitude and devotion. "They're getting fast," Dante murmured, watching his children laugh as the puppy tackled Oliver into the soft grass. "They're happy," Clara corrected softly, leaning back against his solid chest. "We all are." Dante gently turned her around. He looked down at her, the cold, dead eyes of the former mob boss completely replaced by the overwhelming warmth of a man who had been given a second chance at life. He didn't pull out a velvet box, and he didn't drop to one knee. He simply took her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones. "I brought you into a nightmare, Clara," Dante said, his voice a rough, emotional whisper. "And you woke us all up. You saved my children. You saved my soul. I don't have a criminal empire to offer you anymore. I just have me. I am entirely yours, in this life and the next." Clara looked up into the eyes of the man who had burned his own world down just to keep her safe. She dropped her cane, wrapping her good arm around his neck, pulling him down for a kiss that tasted like sunlight, survival, and a love that had literally conquered death. "That," she whispered against his lips, "is exactly what I want." This incredible real-life inspired drama proves that pure love and selfless sacrifice can conquer even the darkest, most dangerous criminal empires. What did you think of Clara's ultimate bravery and Dante's brutal revenge for his family? Let us know in the comments below. If you loved this thrilling mafia romance, hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and share this video. Ring the bell for more gripping stories.